Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of the Random Thoughts of me, Carpo. Whatever it's worth. I'm just I'm just a guy with theories and ideas like anybody else. So, my first disclaimer is that I'm definitely not spitting science here. I'm not trying to school anybody or to try to prove any facts. I just want to make that clear because what I'm about to present are some interesting. Well, there will be facts, but the conclusion that I'm going to lead to or allude to is a little out there, but what isn't, right? I mean, there's so many ludicrous theories out there, things people have believed in the past, but in the last few days I've been studying something really fascinating that I wanted to share, and this was about mind control. Now, step away has nothing to do with the government, this has nothing to do with people. This has to do with bacteria, viruses, and fungi. And anyone who's watched my channel for a while might remember about a year and a half ago I did a video. I've done a few videos about bacteria, but how, for those who aren't aware of this, bacteria, the cells of bacteria in our body make up a majority of our gut. The gut, what they call the probiotics that we take, are obviously to try to supplement these good bacteria that help us digest and break down. We have them in our saliva, we have them all over our body, in our organs, everywhere. These bacteria help us to function. Without them, we would be nothing. Because there are more bacteria in your body than your own cells. So, I made a video a while back saying, what if bacteria is, let's just give it the word God. What if bacteria is our true master? What if we are nothing more than carcasses or shells for the bacteria, and they're using our neural networks to connect for their own good? Now, and I'm going to get into a story here that might kind of shed a little light on where I'm coming from here. The last couple of days I've been studying about parasites that take control of the host's mind. Now, those people know I've mentioned cordyceps before. Now, cordyceps is one of the fungus that I sell, and it's actually grown here in the States. But traditionally, in the mountains of Tibet, it's harvested off of caterpillars, which they get the spores on them. Then the spores get inside their body. When they climb into and they burrow down into the ground before they become moths or butterflies, the cordyceps kill them and then grow out of the top of their head, as if it's this this crazy thing growing out of the top of their head that grows out of the surface, and it's about that big, and you can pick them, and they're very prized. They were considered the most expensive traditional Chinese herbal medicine. Now that they're grown indoors, there's some debate as to whether they're just as efficient or not as the others, but that's not what this is about. This is about this other cordyceps. This one particular is called Ophiocordyceps, and this one has, now first off, cordyceps have over 1,000 species. And that many of them are basically, they all have their own particular their own hosts. And Ophiocordyceps, in the Brazilian jungle, there's a particular strain that, let's just start with the spore. The spores are floating through the air as they land on the ant. From what I understand, because I researched this a little bit to see how it worked, these spores can pack a punch that's equivalent to like a 747. I don't remember how the pressure in a 747 jet tire, and that these spores can explode and blow a hole into these ants. And after they've punctured the thorax or the shell, they get into the bloodstream, and they go straight to the brain, and they control the ant's brain. First thing it does is it makes them kind of have seizures, and then they tend to fall off the leaf. The whole idea is to get them off the top of the canopy to the ground floor. After they do this, the ants proceed to hike what seems like aimlessly through the forest until they reach an area that has the perfect humidity. It's usually 90 to 95%. Then they climb up a branch, and they climb down onto a leaf, which is exactly 25 centimeters above the ground, give or take 2 centimeters, so between 23 and 27 centimeters. Then the ant grabs onto the bottom of the leaf, tightens his grip around the center stem, and dies. After this, the cordyceps come out and erupt from the back of his head. And then these spores are produced, which basically just go poof everywhere. Of course, millions of spores. And Afterwards, and this is another amazing thing, another fungus comes in to eat the cordyceps. And I'm not sure what fungus comes in to eat that fungus, but the point being that everything has its own, part in the food chain. One of the most fascinating things is that this fungus can take control of a mind. Now, there are dozens of parasitic fungi or parasites that we know of that can actually influence behavior. To give you another example, there's one that enters into a snail, reproduces, and then leaves and goes. I believe it gets the snail to go out into the ocean. It gets eaten by a fish. Then it enters the fish, and then it controls the fish's mind, tells the fish to flip upside down up by the top of the water and to flash its stomach, its flashy underbelly, in hopes that it'll get eaten by a bird. So once it gets eaten by a bird, then the whole thing starts all over again, and the droppings from the bird go into the pond. And these are amazing things, because what we found about these parasitic, mind-controlling, which, talking about parasites, that's one thing, because that's a multicellular organism, right? But when we're talking about fungi, how does the fungi take control of the mind? I mean, just think about that for a minute. How does a fungus have this ability? It has DNA, and it has its own genetic code. Mushrooms are closer to us than they are to plants. They're kind of animals in their own right, but not animals, obviously. But it just blows my mind that each one of these adapts to a certain insect. They will only infect the whole colony if there's an overpopulation of one animal or insect. And then they take over. And there are ones that specialize in moths and beetles and crickets. These ones that enter crickets, and then these worms that enter the cricket and then force it to hop down and jump into the water, so then the worm can get out into the water and reproduce, and then the cricket dies. All of these happen when something overpopulates too much. These parasites, whether they be fungi, parasites, or bacteria, which is the interesting one I haven't even gotten into, because bacteria themselves help us produce serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. These compounds that we use for our reality, for our normal state of being and our emotions, are controlled in part by gut bacteria, and probably bacteria elsewhere in the body. And this is a fascinating thing to me, because it says that our moods are strongly affected by other organisms that are within our body. And I can only say so much about that. It's just it amazes me. So, which brings me to my not my conclusion, but rather the point I was coming to make here. How do we know that humans don't have the same parasitic tendencies from perhaps not the parasites that we know of, perhaps ones that are lesser known? If fungus, spores, can enter the body and affect the brain of an ant, what could it do to a human brain? And how would you even be able to identify it if you weren't looking for it? So I've been thinking about this all day, and I thought, what if sociopaths, just as an example, what if sociopaths tend to have a certain, what we might call, hijacking of the brain, whether it be from their own natural bacteria, or perhaps they have too much of one bacteria? If bacteria help us with serotonin in our bodies, and serotonin deals with emotion quite often, and these are still things that are being found out, the whole connection between these, I can only say so much about it, but if our emotions are based on these compounds, then to remove these emotions may very well mean that we have the wrong bacteria, or let's say we're just not properly able to produce them on our own. So it could be a fully genetic trait, it could be something that we just inherit, it could be something due to epigenetics, which was laughable 10 years ago even. The idea that during our lives our behaviors affect our genes for the next generation, that was something that was laughed at, and now it's something that's taken seriously. It's been proven, and it's funny how long it takes to prove something. And I started thinking about all these different human conditions that we have, and how perhaps there's some bacterial hijacking going on, perhaps some parasitic hijacking going on. And what it really tripped me out about this was, here we have an ant which has a fungus. When it enters the ant's body, it teaches the ant something. However it works is still unknown. I read a very scientific, detailed article about how they took ant brains and these Ophiocordyceps, and they tried to see why it was attracted to certain ants and not to others, what chemicals were released in the presence of an ant's brain, because they specify in a particular breed. And there are several compounds they found, but they're still trying to figure out how do these compounds in a fungus know how to latch onto particular parts of a brain and affect them in a very, very specific way. I mean, if the ant just dies, that's one thing. If the ant wanders through the canopy of the forest until he finds a branch, then he climbs up 25 centimeters, grabs on and dies, that's pretty amazing to me. So I started thinking about other mushrooms, such as psilocybin, and how I'd mentioned this the other day about psychedelic compounds, and how people who say, well, I took a psychedelic journey and it taught me something, and they're kind of laughed at. But I'll tell you, I feel like these plants are teachers, and I've always called them plant teachers. The mushrooms are teachers, but it's kind of there's been a part in the back of my mind which says, okay, is it the plant teaching? Or is it just the plant allowing you to tap into that awareness? Or is it your brain rewiring itself to be able to understand things more clearly? Or is it all of the above? It doesn't really seem to matter. I think what does matter is that it does what it does. A psychedelic experience can change a person's life completely, profoundly, just like any other type of, a psychotic episode can do the same thing, or people who have what they call divine epilepsy. And these experiences are so profound and so intense, but the part that I've always been amazed is how psilocybin actually rewires your brain in a certain way. And the question has always been, is it feeding information into our brains, or is it just allowing us to retrieve our own information? And after this cordyceps thing, it makes me really wonder again, because it's telling the ant what to do. And it appears to say that fungus have blueprints for brains. And I know I'm going out on a limb saying that a person may be able to obtain any type of external wisdom, but at the same time I don't believe that anything's really external. And it's kind of hard to explain, but in the sense that I believe that you might call it akasha. The awareness of everything is there and available for us if we only know how to tune our brains. And like I mentioned, various psychedelic compounds like DMT, which seem to put you into a different tuning mode, and that's the only way to describe it. It could be considered divine, spiritual, or it could be a complete diluted experience. But to those who experience these things, it makes you wonder. So are mushrooms taking control of our minds when we take them? I mean, there are deliriants, obviously, such as muscarine. People take, I believe, the Santa Claus mushrooms, if you will. Amanitas are pretty well known, but they're not psychedelic in the same way. So it's different, and it seems like each compound has a specific target of action or mechanism. Just like when animals eat certain plants, it doesn't affect them the way it does humans. Whereas some animals can eat certain plants and get high, and humans don't. We all have different systems. So all of these compounds that are working to change who we are, is there anything changing our minds? Can we, in the future, will we learn that the human mind and what we call consciousness is merely a collection of other beings, or rather that this is what the collective consciousness is that my bacteria and your bacteria, even if you and I don't like each other, your and I bacteria that are the same kind, they don't discriminate. They don't care. When we melt into the soil, they'll go right back to being buddies. So you got to remember that we are mostly bacteria, and these bacteria don't, they don't care. They don't care about your personal gripes about another person. And if bacteria really control our emotion, it makes me really wonder if we're being affected in our decision making, sexual reproduction, the reward system, addictions, all these things could be based in, of course we know they're based in chemistry, but is it an external influence that does any of it? So this video's already gotten pretty long, and I guess I've made the points I wanted to make. I was kind of inspired today to start a group, and I wanted to call it the Amateur Biologists Collective Knowledge Program, or something like that, to where a group of us and at first I thought like 10, I thought that might be too much, but I was thinking about getting 5 people together to research each person an individual thing. Say one person jumps on bacteria, another person's on parasites, another person jumps onto viruses, which I haven't even mentioned yet. Viruses are just mind-blowing. I mean, they infect you, but they don't have any actual mechanisms or cells of their own. They hijack cells in order to reproduce. So they're just little DNA cruising around waiting to reproduce. And the most amazing thing is that we have viruses all over in our body, and they're activated, triggered by certain actions, certain behaviors, certain chemical reactions, whatever it may be. It's still kind of unknown, and I think we can all learn this together, and that's why I think if we got a group of people together to research the latest scientific articles that have been published, and then to post and share things just specific to that, I think that would be really cool. So I think what I'm going to do is actually start a group, and I was thinking of I can't afford to do like a website based on this, but I really feel motivated to start something like this. Because amateur scientists, amateur biologists, people like you and me, don't sell yourself short thinking you can't do experiments. People do it all the time. Very few people have even repeated simple experiments using polygraphs from the 1970s where they were testing plants. And that's another thing I'd like to do, is get a polygraph machine and start doing my own plant tests to see if they react the way that was shown in The Secret Life of Plants, shows like that. And the more we start to do these experiments, the more people will be able to learn from each other, because we can no longer rely on people to do our science for us, because scientists are unfortunately underfunded and overburdened by trying to prove their cases quite often, or to make something work at all costs, or to try to force a formula to fit because they have to keep their funding, and that's a tough thing. But there's also that incentive of funding that keeps people motivated. So I'm looking for individuals who don't want to get paid to do these things, people who don't want to or expect to get anything in return for it other than the feeling of helping other people, and to learn together as a team. So I'm going to start a Facebook group, and when I do, I'll probably post it here on the link, and it'll be very specific, and anybody who wants to contribute, feel free. I want to keep it specific to the idea of the way that our minds are influenced by bacteria, parasites, viruses, and fungi. So it's pretty simple. I think it would be pretty cool, and I think we could really dig a lot of information out, and maybe find certain people have higher levels of certain gut bacteria, and then maybe compare that to behavioral patterns, or because all we can do is look at studies, but we can still probably do some of our own too, and give our personal feedback. But I think the whole line of information is just fascinating. So what do you think? Leave a comment in the comment section, and subscribe and all that crap people say, and support me and give me millions of dollars. I'm just kidding. I find that, at the end of videos, people always do their little Patreon thing. Like, we can't keep going without you. And I'm just grateful that I don't have to do any editing or processing that costs me time and money. I can just make a video and post it. So, yeah. Fascinating stuff. I start to wonder if I'm being controlled by these, and not just being controlled, but rather how much I'm influenced by the things that are in my body. And it really leads one to wonder about what they call demonic possession and these entities. I mean, we know what ergot did to people, ergot poisoning. I mean, yeah, it's a deep subject, but I think that there's a lot to learn. So if anybody wants to share, feel free to shoot me an email or let me know. I'm going to set up the group and see what happens and see what we can